Okay, we'll call to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology for our hearing on Satellite Video 101. I know we had to move this hearing up from earlier scheduled time because of some shifts in our scheduling. So we appreciate your response to this hearing on such a short time notice. And again, this is meant to be an educational hearing, meant to be Satellite Video 101. There will be other hearings where I'm sure there will be a lot of vibrant discussion about what we should do going forward. But I thought it was important for the subcommittee to be able to understand the issues attend with this legislation and what we should or should not do going forward. So we welcome certainly all of our witnesses today and appreciate your willingness to come on short notice. Shiva, Shavira, and Stella. This law has been known by a lot of different names, and many of those acronyms, I'm told, strike fear into the hearts of some. And some, I'm sure, wish they could turn back to Punxsutawney Phil after seeing his shadow. I prefer to see, as Phil did this year, signs of an early spring. So we have an opportunity with our partners in the Judiciary Committee to examine whether the satellite law is still serving its purpose in a video market that frankly would be unrecognizable to those who worked on the original legislation back in 1988. I won't ask for a show of hands of those who did that, but I know at least somebody at the FCC has been involved in all of these. Broadcasting has gone digital. Satellite television is no longer a nascent industry. Phone companies, wired and wireless, are in the video business. Consumers can stream and download their favorite shows over the internet. Viewers have more choices and more expectations than ever before. Companies are trying to keep up, launching new services, embarking on spin-offs, mergers, and partnerships. We've read in the last day or so, Comcast, NBC, Universal, all coming together. Intel proposing a new service of video and experimenting with new business models to meet consumer demand in a new and competitive reality. Our laws are also trying to keep up in a world where traditional classifications and regulations that emanate from them seem increasingly strained. The goal, of course, is to provide consumers more of what they want while ensuring companies have the investment resources to get it to them. Can we better ensure television viewers have access to the broadcast programming of their choice while respecting the rights of stations that transmit it over the air and the networks that create it? Would finally letting the law expire help that cause? Is it better to reauthorize it as is? Or are the revisions called for either narrow or sweeping? Is there something we can do to address the ongoing frustration of viewers who find themselves assigned to local markets that are outside their states or who live in places that don't have a full complement of network affiliates? Today we're going to set the table for this discussion by examining the current state of satellite television law. This is perhaps the most arcane and complicated area of law we confront in this subcommittee, other than Universal Service Fund reform, of course. That's why I thought it wise to start early, giving us ample time to hear from all parties in advance of the December 31st, 2014 sunset that applies to some of the existing provisions. Rest assured, we'll have several more hearings providing additional opportunity to consider not only the satellite issues directly before us, but also affording time to those who would ask us to take this opportunity to revisit other areas of communications law. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Eloise Gore, Associate Bureau Chief of the FCC's Enforcement Bureau. And as I said, my understanding is this could be your fourth reauthorization while at the Commission, if we do in fact reauthorize the law. I want to thank you for your willingness to share your expertise. It's most helpful. I also want to set some ground rules. Ms. Gore is in a position to share her considerable knowledge on how the law operates and perhaps even on what may be working and may not. She will not, however, be making policy recommendations on how the law should change, so please don't ask her to do that. That's a pleasure reserved for us on this dais and in the Congress, in consultation with our constituents back home and those in the television business who can help us create an environment that entertains, informs, and creates jobs. I'd turn now to the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Latta, for the remaining amount of my time.
I appreciate the Chairman for yielding, and I also thank our distinguished panel for being here today. I believe that today will be the beginning of a thoughtful and productive policy process. We have important issues in the satellite TV industry, as the Chairman said, before us, which we all know need to be addressed by the end of next year when the Satellite Television Extension Localism Act of 2010, STELA, expires. I also look forward to a thorough discussion among our subcommittee members, stakeholders, and consumers as we grapple with the issues in STELA and others stemming from our decades-old communication and cable laws. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the hearing today and hearing from our witnesses on the subject, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now turn to the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes and an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, to all the members of the subcommittee, and most importantly, our witnesses. I might note that in my memory, I think this is the first time I'm looking at a panel where the majority of those that are testifying are women. So congratulations and welcome. Mr. Chairman, less than 3 years ago, Congress passed and the President signed into law the Satellite Television Extension and Localism Act of 2010, STELA. Ms. Gore, maybe that's we should rename you, give you that as your first name. I'm pleased, as the chairman is, and other members, that we're starting this discussion of reauthorization early. And only to ensure that adequate time, so that we have the adequate time to work through all the relevant issues, the new ideas that come forward, but also for the benefit of the several new members of our subcommittee. And that's very important, so that the level of understanding is brought up, so that we're all up to speed on this. The estimate of one analyst today is that because of STELA, between 1 and 1.5 million satellite subscribers who live in areas where a signal from the local network affiliate is not possible now have access to broadcast programming. These satellite subscribers also enjoy the benefits of public television stations' multi-digital signals, as well as their HD transmission, ensuring that consumers from all states have the opportunity to view publicly funded programming. One of my all-time favorites, so I think that it's important to underscore that. While my preference is to pursue a clean reauthorization of STELA, there will no doubt be other video-related topics raised over the course of this Congress. And chief amongst my concerns are the programming disruptions that consumers experience when retransmission disputes break down. Simply put, consumers should not be held hostage when negotiators fail to come to an agreement. These high-profile disputes have impacted millions of Americans, often prior to or during highly watched programming such as the 2010 World Series. And that simply is not acceptable. I mean, it's where are the adults in the room kind of thing. And our constituents all pay the price for it. I'm fascinated by the emergence of new video services such as Skitter and Sky Angel. These companies challenge existing business models, which is disruptive but very important. And they provide a new means of delivering traditional broadcast or cable content into the homes of consumers. I think these services can contribute to the establishment of a vibrant video marketplace that promotes both consumer choice and competition. So today's panel of witnesses offer and will offer a wealth of knowledge to us, spanning from the FCC to a cross-section of impacted industries, including broadcast, satellite, and content. I thank each witness in advance of their testimony and for working with us to reauthorize STELA, and I yield back the balance of my time, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize the distinguished chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is hard to believe that the time has already come to revisit the satellite TV legislation. For members on this committee, it's almost become a rite of passage. Americans now have an endless amount of content available to them and the technology at their fingerprints to watch it at almost any time, anywhere, and on any device. Our job is to create an atmosphere where they can do so in a way that respects the investments of the companies that create and distribute that content, as well as the underlying economics necessary to make those businesses work. We need to do our very best to make sure that our laws don't prevent willing producers of programming to strike arrangements with willing distributors to reach interested viewers. The issues surrounding this particular law are by no means easy to grapple, but it is important that we do so. The competitive landscape has evolved significantly in the video marketplace, and we must ensure our laws are having their intended effect. If they're no longer needed, they need to be eliminated. If they are missing the mark, they should be revised. If they are working well, we should leave them alone. But periodic oversight is essential to make that determination. And it's particularly true of all laws in the communication sector. Technology is changing this industry at an astonishing rate, and we must work to ensure that our laws keep pace, fostering continued growth, particularly in the innovation area. And indeed, while it certainly makes for more work, we should consider using the sunset provisions perhaps a little bit more often. I look forward to the testimony and the interaction, and yield the balance of my time to Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. Just make a couple of observations at the outset of the hearing. It's clear that based on some of today's written testimony, that as much as some want to focus only on the expiring narrow satellite provisions, there's also an interest in raising other interconnected issues, like additional compulsory licenses, retransmission consent rules, and regulations that govern negotiations between broadcasters and pay TV providers. If stakeholders want to describe the various compulsory copyright licenses of 1976 and 1988 as relics or anachronistic, which I'll be the first to agree with, then I'm sure they'd also agree that the same is true of the 1992 Cable Act. The truth here is that there's a litany of regulations still burdening the video marketplace that have been piled one on top of the other over the years. So much has changed in the video distribution since the days before the commercialization of the Internet, and it's time that we recognize this fact. So I welcome this expanded conversation, appreciate our panelists for coming, and look forward to the hearing. Yield back.
I understand Mr. Barton wanted some time.
Sure. Well, I've been here long enough to remember before we had the Satellite Home Viewer Act. I just purchased a new home down in Texas. If it was a car dealer, it would be a pre-owned home. And back in the backyard is one of these huge satellite dishes that could get the signal from the satellite directly, not through dish or anything like that. I have no idea what it's worth. I have tried to figure out a way to salvage it and perhaps sell it for scrap. But I bet when that satellite dish was purchased, they probably paid $5,000 to $10,000 for it. Well, today we don't need it, and we're here for the second or third reauthorization of the Satellite Home Viewers Act. It's good that we're doing this ahead of time. I want to commend the subcommittee chairman and the full committee chairman for moving to reauthorize something before it's expired. That's a good thing. And it appears we're going to have a bipartisan hearing and a bipartisan reauthorization. I supported the original legislation. I've supported all the reauthorizations, and I look forward to a similar situation in this committee in the near future. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else on the Republican side seeking time? If not, we'll move on then to our witnesses. And before we do that, Mr. Waxman is not able to be with us at this hearing this morning. I do have his opening statement, which I'd ask unanimous consent to be allowed to be put into the record without objection. So done. Now we'll turn to our witnesses. Again, we want to thank you for putting together your testimony and being able to be here on short notice. We're going to start with Ms. Eloise Gore, the Associate Bureau Chief of the Enforcement Bureau, Federal Communications Commission. Ms. Gore, thank you very much for being here. Slide that microphone close and turn it on, and the show is yours for the next 5 minutes. No?
There we go.
There we go.
Very good. Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I am currently the Associate Bureau Chief for the Enforcement Bureau at the FCC, but for most of my FCC career, I was in the Media Bureau, where my responsibilities included the Satellite Home Viewer Act, SHIVA, and its progeny, Shavia, Shavira, and Stella. I was pleased to provide technical assistance to Congress on these reauthorization bills, as well as spearheading the implementation of the enacted laws. I appreciate the chance to participate with the subcommittee and my fellow panelists this morning in Satellite Video 101 to refamiliarize ourselves with the legislative and regulatory structure we have in place. My written statement provides a broad overview of the statutory changes made by the previous reauthorization and the expiring provisions. I'd like to spend my brief time this morning outlining how the current rules apply to consumers. As noted in my written statement, my views are my own, and I'm very happy to provide technical assistance, but will respectfully decline to provide any opinions on suggested modifications. Stella and its predecessors govern satellite delivery of broadcast television to satellite subscribers and treat local and distant broadcast stations in different ways. Local channels are the stations that are assigned to the designated market area, DMA, in which the subscriber resides based on designations by the Nielsen Media Company. My outstanding colleague, Lori Morbier, will hold up the map, which is a precious commodity, I must tell you. Thank you, Lori. Nicely done. Distant signals are those stations that are assigned to a different DMA from the one in which the subscriber resides. Shavia created local-into-local service in 1999. Initially, the two satellite providers offered the local stations in fewer than 40 out of the 210 DMAs. Now they have increased their local market offerings so that nearly all subscribers in the 210 designated market areas have access to the local station package from one or both satellite carriers. Dish provides service to all 210. DirecTV, I believe, provides service to 196 of the markets. The local stations available to satellite subscribers are essentially limited to the stations designated for the DMA, although there are some additional options in certain circumstances, such as significantly viewed stations or distant stations that can be used to fill in what we call a short market, where there are not four of the top four networks available over the air. And there are certain areas in the country in which Congress provided a special exception to allow carriage of additional signals in a local market. Distant signals are generally available only to satellite subscribers who are unserved by an over-the-air signal and for whom the local-into-local stations are not available. We call this no distant where local. This being 101, I'll try to describe some of the little terminology that you'll hear us use. Local into local, no distant where local, DMA, goes by in a hurry. Unserved means that the subscriber's household cannot receive the over-the-air signal of a local network station with sufficient signal strength. Notwithstanding the principle of no distant where local, some subscribers have been statutorily grandfathered as the eligibility rules have changed in successive reauthorizations. Some of the grandfathered subscribers may keep signals. Others may at some point be required to relinquish the distant signals. And some subscribers who are outside the satellite's spot beam and therefore unable to receive the local package may also be eligible for distant signals. Distant signal subscribers are limited to no more than 2 network-affiliated signals from each broadcast network. Time shifting will be limited based on the subscriber's local time zone. The subscriber cannot specify which distant signals he or she wishes to receive. Further, the satellite carrier is only permitted to provide distant signals if it complies with the requirement to provide the net list of the subscribers who are the local signal to a subscriber via satellite. The subscriber may request signals through his or her satellite carrier. The carrier determines whether the subscriber is considered served or unserved by using a computer model that produces signals at the subscriber's household. Satellite carriers use a computer model designed by the ILL computer model, but the Commission is not involved in making individual predictions. If the model determines the household is unserved, that is, the signal strength is too low from the broadcast station, the satellite carrier is permitted to provide distant net signals to the household. If the model predicts that the household is served by a particular local network station over the air, the household is not eligible for distant signals for that network. The subscriber may request waivers from each of the local stations that are predicted to serve the household in order to be eligible for distant signals. Waivers are requested through the satellite carrier, and the local broadcast station must accept or reject a waiver request within 30 days. If the local station denies the waiver request, the subscriber can request a signal test to measure the actual signal strength of the over-the-air signal. Finally, the law allows satellite carriers to provide distant signals to subscribers in some other situations, such as recreational vehicles, commercial trucks, or C-band satellite receivers. Mr. Barton, your C-band may be useful yet. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. I look forward to assisting the committee as it begins this reauthorization process and would be happy to take your questions. Thank you so much.
That's the best news Joe's gotten all day. We now turn to our next witness, Mr. R. Stanton Dodge, who's the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of DISH. Mr. Dodge, thanks for joining us this morning. We look forward to your testimony.
Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, Chairman Upton, and members of the subcommittee. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify today. My name is Stanton Dodge, and I am the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of DISH Network, the nation's third largest pay TV provider with over 14 million customers and 25,000 employees nationwide. This morning I'd like to highlight the benefits that Stella and its predecessors have conferred upon consumers. Stella provided two big wins for consumers, giving them access to more programming than ever before. First, it challenged DISH to offer local stations in all of the nation's 210 television markets. We embraced that challenge, and today we're the only pay TV provider to offer local channels in every market. Plus, we're the largest distributor of PBS nationwide. Second, Stella allowed us to give consumers in short markets access to all of the Big Four networks. And for those of you who don't know, short markets are markets that lack one or more of the Big Four stations, and they tend to be small, rural communities. Thanks to Stella, consumers in 21 short markets across 19 states can watch the valued network programming that the rest of the country has long enjoyed. So how did we get here? Well, let's start with the basics. We all know that broadcast stations are important to consumers. They're freely available over the air, but even after the digital transition, many households cannot get a signal, especially in large Western markets. Over-the-air reception often just cannot match the coverage and consistency of satellite and cable television. The first incarnation of Stella, the Satellite Home Viewer Act of 1988, created a statutory copyright license that enabled satellite carriers to provide consumers with broadcast signals originating outside of their home markets. This copyright license came with an important restriction. It only allowed network transmissions to, quote, unserved households, households that could not receive a strong local signal using an off-air antenna. In exchange for the license, satellite carriers paid a monthly per-subscriber fee to the Copyright Office. That fee was set either by private negotiations or by an administrative proceeding, and the revenues were then distributed to the mosaic of copyright holders. This copyright fee structure remains in place today. Congressional legislation evolved further in 1994, 1999, and 2004, and throughout this time, technological advances prompted significant updates to the law. For example, with the advent of spot beam technology, satellites could target signals into individual local markets rather than the whole country at once. This led Congress to add the so-called local-into-local license, which allowed for satellite retransmission of local broadcast signals back into their local markets. Satellite carriers seized that new opportunity. They built and launched spot beam satellites, and they started providing local stations almost immediately. As a result, satellite providers emerged as a key competitive force in the pay TV market. And I'd ask everyone to please refer to my written remarks for a more comprehensive summary of the various satellite television bills over the year. And as many of you are aware, DISH was enjoined from providing distant network signals to subscribers in 2006 after a decade-long court proceeding. Among other things, the injunction prevented us from filling up short markets because we needed a distant signal license to import the out-of-market stations to replace the missing local affiliates. Through Stella, Congress presented an incentive for DISH to receive a waiver of that injunction if we offered local stations in all of the nation's 210 markets. Then they would allow us to win back our distant signal license. Working cooperatively with the NAB, we followed the path precisely as Congress envisioned. The result? On June 3, 2010, we initiated service to all local TV markets, becoming the first and to date the only pay TV provider to offer local service in all 210 DMAs. And so, Stella stands as an example of how targeted legislative solutions can work to everybody's benefit. It should be reauthorized before December 31, 2014, but there is much more that Congress can do through Stella to expand consumers' access to local programming. In an era of fast-changing technology and the explosion of video on the Internet, we believe that Congress should take this opportunity to look at ways that the current statute could be updated to better reflect consumer expectations and desires. We look forward to a dialogue addressing those options in the months ahead, and I thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today and look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Dodge. We appreciate your being here and your testimony. We now go to the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Legal and Regulatory Affairs of the National Association of Broadcasters, Jane Mago. We're delighted to have you here this morning. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Chairman Walden.
Go ahead and turn that on. Yeah, these have
Turn
to be
on the
pretty
microphone,
close.
that basic apply. Thank you, Chairman Walden, and thanks to Ranking Member Eshoo and Chairman Upton and all the members of the subcommittee for having me here to speak with you today. As Chairman Walden just said, I am the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the National Association of Broadcasters. Now, over the next 2 years, this subcommittee, as well as your colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, will consider whether certain provisions of the legislation that's affectionately known to all of us as Stella should be allowed to sunset. The narrow issue that is before you is whether the legal framework that permits the country's 2 satellite providers to retransmit our stations continues to be in the public interest. As the committee begins this dialogue, your broadcast constituents ask you to be mindful of 2 principles that are at the core of Stella and all of its predecessors that we've heard about today. First, free, over-the-air, local television should remain widely available to American households. And second, the government should not interfere with the contractual relationships that promote broadcasting's local focus. Adherence to these principles will help ensure that the public benefits from free over-the-air broadcasting. Now, the bedrock principle of the American broadcast system continues to be this localism. Whether it's local news, emergency alerts, weather information, election coverage, or sports, local television broadcasters provide these services and programming for free to communities across the country. Broadcasters support charities, civic organizations, and community events. And our locally tailored advertising provides the opportunity for your hometown businesses to promote their goods and services. Simply put, free local service is our focus. It is what differentiates American broadcast television from others around the world and from every other medium. Broadcasters have invested billions of dollars in recent years to improve the quality and reach of our service. The digital television transition allowed us to proliferate high-definition programming, launch mobile DTV service, and offer multiple program streams. These innovations enable our viewers, who are also your constituents, to receive higher quality and more diverse programming on many platforms. Now, as you've heard, in the beginning, the satellite acts were crafted to help the satellite companies become competitive with cable services and ensure that satellite subscribers could access network programming. There was always a concern, however, that the service should not undermine local broadcast stations. And so specifically, Congress prohibited a satellite provider from importing a network signal from a distant market to households that could receive that network's programming from a local station. These provisions were and remain essential to prevent diversion of local station viewers and reduction in the advertising revenue that's needed to provide vital local services. Now, even as it created this distant signal license, Congress foresaw that one day technological advances might make that license unnecessary. So it included a 5-year sunset provision. That premonition was really correct. Technology has evolved so that satellite companies could provide each market with the market's own local signals. As Stanton just told us, today DISH provides this local service into all 210 television markets, and DirecTV is in either 195 or 196. That's not somewhat clear, but thus the need to import distant network signals has dramatically diminished. Only a small percentage of the 34 million satellite subscribers receive network programming via this distant signal. Indeed, over 98% of all U.S. television viewers have the option of viewing their local networks. So accordingly, this subcommittee may want to consider whether the public interest would be best served by allowing the distant signal and related Communications Act provisions to sunset as Congress originally intended. Because local viewers are best served when they receive local service, every satellite and cable subscriber should receive this local into local service. Now, alternatively, if Stella is reauthorized, broadcasters urge a clean, minimalist approach targeted to the problem to be solved. Efforts to graft unrelated and unnecessary issues onto this narrow legislation would be inappropriate and unwise. I thank you for all your efforts to promote vibrant local broadcast industry now and into the future, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Ms. Mago, thank you very much for your testimony. We'll now go to Jennifer Keeley, and before we do, I should point out that she's a fill-in witness this morning. Lana Thompson was supposed to testify but fell ill last night, and so be kind to Jennifer. She's a Director of Government Relations, Association of Public Television Stations, and Lana is the Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, and General Counsel for our Association of Public Television Stations. So today we have the Director of Government Relations, Jennifer Keeley. Jennifer, thank you for joining us. We look forward to the testimony of the public television stations.
Thank you, Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Eshoo and members of the subcommittee. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to substitute in Lana's place today on this very important issue to the Association of Public Television Stations. This issue is of great importance to our 368 local public television stations throughout this country. It has a tremendous influence on the services that are available to your constituents, our viewers, nationwide, but particularly those living in rural America that are often limited to their paid television programming options and disproportionately depend on satellite services. First and foremost, we'd like to thank this committee and the Congress as a whole for the passage of Stella, which recognized the critical services that local public broadcasting stations provide their communities nationwide. Because of that legislation, viewers in even the most remote corners of this country that receive local satellite HD service have access to the best that public television has to offer in the full splendor of HD. We are also appreciative of the language that was included in Stella, which allows satellite carriers to carry local public television's statewide licensees signals throughout the entire state where DBS providers have the bandwidth to do so. This provision removes statutory roadblocks that restricted the ability of residents and states to receive the full benefits of their state's public television network. Public broadcasting is charged by the Public Broadcasting Act with providing universal service to every corner of this country, and Stella has enabled us to help meet this mission and provide the highest quality of services to our satellite viewers. As Congress looks to reauthorize Stella, public television proudly highlights the private carriage agreements that we've been able to negotiate with almost all major MVPDs. Rather than rely on Congress to work out these carriage agreements, which can admittedly be challenging, we pioneered our own private agreements with cable, Verizon, and DirecTV. And before the passage of Stella, we were still hopeful that we would be able to negotiate a similar carriage agreement with DISH. Unfortunately, after years of unsuccessful negotiations, we were never able to close a deal with DISH that would have guaranteed carriage of all of our station's HD signals. As a result, before Stella was signed into law, DISH was not carrying a single HD signal of any local public television station. But Stella mandated the carriage of local public television stations' HD signals by any carrier that had not entered into a private carriage agreement with public television. And now DISH is required by law to carry the local HD signals of public television stations in all markets where they offer local HD service. This provision was included in Stella because Congress recognized the unique educational mission of local public television stations and the void that was felt by citizens that were previously denied access to these critical services. And we were also pleased that when DISH challenged this law in the courts upheld Stella. As a result of Stella, viewers in Oregon are able to watch Oregon Field Guide, a valuable source of information about outdoor recreational issues, ecological issues, natural resources, and travel destinations in the full detail of HD. In the San Francisco Bay Area, subscribers to satellite have access to the HD version of Quest, KQED's award-winning multimedia science and environment series. And in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Nebraska, and communities nationwide, Americans can travel the galaxies with NOVA, tune in for a live performance at the Met, celebrate the 4th of July with a front row seat in the nation's capital, and catch up on the latest dramas of Downton Abbey, All this and so much more in the stunning display of high-def television. This is public television as it's meant to be seen and appreciated. Public television is in the business of providing local public service. We treat our viewers as citizens, not consumers. Our stations provide over 98% of Americans with the highest quality, free, educational media available. And in addition to all the great broadcast services that local public television stations offer, our stations are also providing cutting-edge public services to communities beyond the broadcast, from educational services to public safety to veterans job retraining. These services and so much more are part of the vibrant public service media that this country has invested in, and we are proud to deliver to your constituents. Because an investment in public media is truly an investment in the unique needs of local communities nationwide. Again, we'd like to thank this committee, and particularly Representative Eshoo, who authored the amendment which guaranteed our HD carriage, for all your work in crafting legislation that recognized the incredible value and critical services that are provided by local public television stations. And thank you for inviting us to participate in today's hearing, and we look forward to continuing to work closely with you as you prepare to reauthorize this legislation.
Thank you, Ms. Keeley, and I can assure you that we're not going to get between your viewers and Downton Abbey.
Good plan.
Not be good. Let's go now to Mr. Michael O'Leary, who's Senior Executive Vice President, Global Policy and External Affairs, the Motion Picture Association of America. Mr. O'Leary, thanks for joining us this morning and rounding out our panel. We look forward to your testimony, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Walden, Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify this morning on behalf of the Motion Picture Association of America. I also want to acknowledge my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be on the panel with the folks today and to provide our perspective on the potential reauthorization that this subcommittee is undertaking. My message on behalf of the industry that creates much of what you see on television is very simple and very straightforward. The satellite and the cable compulsory license are historical anachronisms that are no longer justified in today's television programming marketplace. If those licenses were to be retained, however, they should not be expanded in our view. Program owners should be more fairly compensated, and a direct marketplace should be encouraged. I want to be clear at the outset that we share the goal that was articulated by the chairman in his opening remarks, and I believe by everyone on this committee, and that is to provide consumers with the highest quality entertainment and informational experience possible, and to expand choices available in television in new and innovative ways. At the same time, it's imperative that the hardworking men and women who invest their talent and capital to create the programming receive fair market compensation, and that the law promote marketplace innovation. Mr. Chairman, there's no better time to be a consumer of content than today. And we are confident that the future will bring even more high-quality entertainment to viewers around the nation and, frankly, to those around the world. The studios I represent create much of the programming that we all enjoy today. We have an incentive to get those programs in front of as many viewers as possible, and we believe that the marketplace can have a big role in making that happen. Just as the television landscape will continue to evolve in the months and years ahead, it has changed dramatically since the enactment of the compulsory licenses being discussed here and in the coming months. The market conditions that led Congress to create the cable and the satellite compulsory licenses have long since disappeared. Congress decided, as you know, in 1976 and again in 1988 to introduce compulsory licenses to help what were then fledgling cable and satellite industries acquire retransmission rights in television programming. Government intervention in the marketplace was deemed necessary at those times to ensure the viability of what were then new services. Today, the overwhelming majority of programming being offered by cable and satellite is licensed through marketplace transactions. There's simply no justification in today's market for satellite or cable compulsory licenses. There's certainly no justification for retaining a license that imposed below market rates for the acquisition of that programming. As my written testimony notes, the royalty rate paid by satellite carriers under Section 119 today is roughly the equivalent of the market rate paid for programming in 1999, almost 15 years ago. At the same time, in that same period of years, the cost of producing programming has continued to increase. Today, the cable and satellite industries are, to their credit, very successful. They have over 90 million subscribers and report a combined revenue in excess of $80 billion. The compulsory license royalty fees paid, however, equal less than 0.5% of their combined revenues. One cannot help but ask how government intervention in licensing of retransmitted programming by these industries can be justified in today's marketplace. And we believe this should be a threshold consideration for the committee as you move forward over the next 2 years. Should Congress, however, as a result of these proceedings, determine that compulsory licenses should be prolonged, we would strongly urge the committee not to expand either license to new market entrants. Congress should not further impede the ability of program owners to obtain the true economic value of their work, and instead should encourage development of marketplace regimes. On behalf of our members, Mr. Chairman, I again want to express our sincere gratitude to you and this committee for holding this hearing, for getting, as you indicated, an early start. This is a complicated issue. It's a difficult issue, and we are confident that this will be the first of many conversations over the next few months, and we welcome and look forward to the opportunity to be a part of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Leary. You're absolutely right. We will have additional hearings and I'm sure a lot of conversations in the months ahead. That concludes our panelists' testimony. We appreciate all of your words and your comments. I'll start out with questions this morning, and this one's for the entire panel. I've read reports that, to the extent they're able to answer, I've read reports that between 1 and 1.5 million subscribers still receive distant signals. Is that accurate? Are those households predominantly rural, urban, or evenly distributed? And if Congress were to let the retransmission consent exemption and the distant signal compulsory license expire, would those households lose access to all local broadcast service? So first, is the 1 million to 1.5 million number correct? Where are those households? And what happens if we allow the distant signal compulsory license and retransmission consent exemption to expire? Ms. Gore, can you tackle any piece of that? And use your, yeah, Mike.
The only piece of that that I can tackle, we do not keep figures on how many distant subscribers there are out there. I believe my colleagues on the panel here may be able to help you out there. I am aware that the distant signal license is used, as I think we all touched on, in many different circumstances. Sometimes it's someone who doesn't have access to any local broadcast stations, and so they are receiving what I tend to call a truly distant signal, which would mean perhaps from New York or Los Angeles when they're not at all in that area. There are other situations where the distant signal license, I gather, is used for filling in a short market, which we've talked about, and there the signal is coming from generally a more nearby area. What would happen if the distant signal license were let to expire, I cannot say. I know that the Copyright Office studied this, and I know that the GAO looked into what the Copyright Office had reported, so they probably can speak for themselves.
Got it.
But it is a complex intertwining.
All right. Mr. Dodge?
I'm not exactly sure, I must admit, where the 1 million to 1.5 million number came from. I know at DISH we actually don't keep track, although we may be able to get you that information, so we'll take an action item to try and do that. But certainly I believe it's a bigger issue for DirecTV today because the utility of the license is a little different for each of us, whereas DirecTV still has some grandfathered subscribers, I believe, from years gone by, and they're not in all 210 markets today. They still use a true distant license, therefore, I believe, providing programming to unserved households in the markets where they don't offer local programming. But how many customers that might impact, I don't know.
Okay.
And with respect to DISH, we use the license primarily for 3 purposes, the largest of which is to fill in short markets, as Ms. Gore noted. So for example, in a market where someone doesn't have a Fox station, we import a Fox so that they're able to watch American Idol and similar programming just like all other Americans. And without the license, we would have to shut those people off. Similarly, we provide service outside the spot beam to certain customers, which allows, so say for a state like Utah, which is largely a rectangle, our spot beams are round, and so the corners get cut off. And unless those folks are able to get local programming via an off-air antenna, we'd have to shut those folks off as well, and RVs and commercial trucks too.
All right. Ms. Mago?
I think what you've heard here is that there's getting to be fewer and fewer of these people that use the distant signal license. And I think it is the exact number would be in the hands of the carriers to know that number, and I don't know that we have it. But even those instances that Mr. Dodge just talked about, they're becoming fewer and fewer. as well, because as you provide local into local service into all 210 markets, it's relatively easy to provide that local signal to anyone within that spot beam, and that seems to be a logical thing to do. Short markets are also disappearing as a result of the digital television transition. A lot of stations are able to use their multicast capacity to provide a second network signal within the market. So I think the key point for us continues to be our focus on localism and making sure that we recognize how much fewer there are.
All right. And I'm going to go to Ms. Keeley and then Mr. O'Leary, but I'm running out of time, so sorry.
Well, my answer will be easy. We unfortunately do not track that at the Association of Public Television Stations and defer to our friends in the satellite industry to help us get a better handle on that. But I will echo what Ms. Mago has said, that localism is, a top priority for us in public television. All right.
Mr. O'Leary.
I will be brief. I can't validate that number. I have no way to dispute it. It ultimately would lie with the carriers. I agree with the comments of Ms. Mago. I would also note that even if it's retained, the distance signal license is still woefully under market. The rate is still woefully under market.
Okay. I thank you all for your answers, and now turn to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Eshoo, for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to the panel for your very helpful testimony. I have a whole list of questions, and I think that I'll submit them in writing. But I want to ask you, with the exception of Ms. Gore, since she put it right out there that she was not going to recommend any kind of policy, no policy recommendations, to the four of you, starting with Mr. Dodge. So I've got 5 minutes with four people, so about a minute and a half. If you were going to choose your top policy preference in the reauthorization of Stella, what would it be? So that's to each one of you.
It would be to ensure that consumers are able to continue to receive network programming during retransmission disputes.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you.
As I said in my opening testimony, our top policy preference is to preserve localism and allow broadcasters to continue to provide the service to their communities.
Mm-hmm. Great. Kylie?
We just hope that any reauthorization of Stella continues to recognize the unique services of local public television stations and how we are different in the marketplace.
Well, I'm here.
We do appreciate that.
Thank God we got that one worked out.
And
thank you, Mr. Dodge. Thank you for your advocacy.
And that would be our top priority, as well as maintaining a vibrant local service for our public television stations.
Great, thank you. And Mr. O'Leary.
Sure. I think that our top priority, as I outlined, is to get the content that we make in front of as many people as possible. That's our business model in simplest terms, and I think that we would advocate that the committee do that by one of two ways. One would be to step back and look at the entire context and see if the current regime continues to make sense, and if it ultimately comes to the conclusion that there needs to be some type of regime in place, to make sure that it's updated to reflect the times in which we live and it's not necessarily bound up in the past.
Thank you very much. I think that we need to know more from you about, you referred to content, and I think there's an older context to it. And I think that there needs to be a new appreciation on the part of members of what you mean exactly by content and the Motion Picture Industry Association and in the 21st century. I think there's so many exciting things, but I would just make that as a recommendation.
Absolutely, and we'd be happy to provide that.
Members really be instructed and be brought up to snuff on what you're referring to. So, well, that's great. We've got, I like all of your answers. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, bounds for time. Chair now recognizes Mr. Barton.
I'm here.
5 minutes. I was looking down my list and others weren't.
My name
hadn't
changed.
gavel dropping. So,
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Leary, I want to make sure I understand. Your testimony is not that these acts should not be reauthorized. It's that certain parts of them should be allowed to expire. Is that correct?
I think there is that is something that should be part of the consideration that you undertake over the next 2 months, is whether or not it's essential to reauthorize all aspects of this. Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
I want to make sure I understand before I go to Mrs. Mago. Is that right? Mago. The motion picture industry is not advocating allowing them to expire. It is simply saying we should think about it. So you're a little bit. You're not a hard. You're kind of a medium soft. Am I right? I mean, I'm not being funny.
No, I understand. I think that we believe that, as I said in my testimony, that certain provisions here are anachronistic and that they do not necessarily need to be, they could be allowed to expire. Having said that, we're also mindful, as has been alluded to in the comments made by members of the panel and members of this panel, this is an incredibly complex web of pieces that all kind of fit together. And so what I'm trying to portray to you is I'm not trying to be soft and squishy and in the middle, but the truth of the matter is I'm trying to be realistic. We think that some of these things are woefully outdated and could be allowed to expire. We think
but
that
that's different than supporting the expiration. So let me ask you a straight question,
Sure.
Yes or no. If this subcommittee and the full committee were to support a clean, straight reauthorization, no changes except the date, would your industry support that? Yes or no?
I'm not in a position to say right now what they would support. I do think that would be preferable, frankly, Congressman, to expanding the license in any way.
I'm going to go to Mrs. Magoo, since I've gotten a pretty squishy answer from Mr. O'Leary. Would your trade association support clean reauthorization with no changes except the dates?
I'm sorry, Mr. Barton, I have to frustrate you as well. We are so early in this process that at this point we are still considering where the marketplace is, as I indicated, and while we see that there are anachronistic pieces and we think that expiration should be on the table, we haven't formed a final position.
So if we put your group with Mr. O'Leary's group, y'all will hug each other and then talk around each other for as long as we allow you to.
We'd all hug each other on this panel. We're like that.
Anyway, okay. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I would definitely vote for a clean reauthorization. If there is a meeting of the minds from the stakeholders, I'd certainly take a look at that. My guess is that the stakeholders have different views, and as they should, because of the economic consequences, and it's probably not as much peace and love at that table as they're portraying this morning.
And we could bring some other folks up, and there'd be real fireworks.
Right.
Anyway.
Thank you, Mr.
Not
Chairman.
do that today. I thank the gentleman, and now we go to Mr. Luan from New Mexico for questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. To Ms. Gore, there's some questions that I have for you which maybe aren't appropriate for this hearing, but we'll be working with the FCC to look into the equitable treatment of tribal communities, as well as we talk about some of the rulings and renderings in many of the very complex world. So I will get those to you and submit them into the record. But for today's hearing, I'm interested with all the witnesses. Should Congress consider the changes in the competitive landscape for video services as we examine Stella, and especially with the question that Ranking Member Eshoo asked? Content is very much different now. We're getting content in many different areas, and how far-reaching should this be, or what should be included in that? Ms. Gore?
Well, I think I have mentioned that I'm not going to give too many opinions. I will note one factual point, and that is that one of the things that expires is the requirement in Section 325 of the Communications Act for good faith negotiating. So that's one of the expiring provisions that perhaps you might want to consider.
Appreciate it. Mr. Dodge?
I guess what I would say policy-wise is we think that the law needs to be improved to address the interests of consumers in two key areas, which are one, and really in the spirit of localism, that consumers should be able to get network programming during takedowns, and two, folks in orphan counties, which are counties that actually are in a state but don't receive signals from a DMA in that state, should be given the opportunity to get local network channels from their state.
I would agree with that. Ms. Vega?
First of all, let me say for the record that broadcasters are always in favor of good faith. We negotiate in good faith all the time, and we'll continue to do that as appropriate to make sure that consumers are able to receive our signals, because that is very important. It's important for us to reach every single member of our audiences that we can. I think as we look at this legislation, as I indicated earlier, you've got to look at localism. Providing that local into local service in all 210 markets is a very important goal.
I appreciate that.
I would just say on behalf of public television that we recognize that these are very complex issues, many of which are intertwined, and we are very appreciative of the chairman and the leadership of this committee for taking an early look at this piece of legislation. And we continue to look forward to working with Congress as you look at these issues. We too are looking at them. We're early into the implementation, it feels, from the passage of Stella. And we're looking closely, as I mentioned to Ms. Eshu's question, we first and foremost would want to make sure that any type of legislation that looks at the overall video competition would recognize a unique role that local public television stations play in that marketplace and preserve some of the unique protections that have been in place for our local public television stations.
Appreciate it. Mr. Laird?
Congressman, I don't know that I have a whole lot to add at this point. I don't disagree with anything I heard.
That's a good answer. All right.
I'll stop.
It's nice when we find some common ground there. Ms. Gore, does the FCC have information on how many consumers are receiving distant signals? How many of those households are receiving distant signals because Congress has grandfathered them in during previous satellite authorizations?
No, Mr. Lujan, we do not have that information. That's not provided to us. We don't track how many distant signal subscribers.
Does anyone have that information?
We don't actually have any grandfathered subscribers at Dish.
Okay. Anyone? No?
I think it's uniquely in the hands of the carriers.
Okay. Maybe we can go to the carriers and chat with them. Mr. Dodge, do you agree with Mr. O'Leary's statement that the current satellite royalty rates under Section 119 are only equal to the market rate from 1999?
Well, I agree with Mr. O'Leary in one key point. We certainly are all for fully compensating artists, as they well deserve. And we're all for paying them market rates. I guess, in our view, the devil's in the detail of what a market rate should be. And if the proxy for that are retransmission rates today, we would argue that that is not a fair market rate because it's not a fair fight today. In each DMA, you've got one broadcaster who effectively has been given a monopoly and plays all of the distributors off each other, and the rates are just going up 100% each year. And we would put forth that those are not comparable market rates. But we also think the system today works, where we sit down with the interested stakeholders, the MPAA, the sports leagues, and negotiate what the rate should be after each reauthorization. And if we don't reach an agreement, then I believe it goes to the FCC or the Copyright Office to actually arbitrate that. And we've been able to reach agreement every reauthorization to this point.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. And as I yield back, it's been brought up about the economic consequences and whether there's a permit or a reauthorization or Stella is not reauthorized. Mr. Chairman, I hope that we're able to explore what the economic consequences are one way or another and what those impacted parties will fully realize. So thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, Mr. Latta.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks very much to our panel for being here. And, these are really important questions. I represent kind of, you might consider a suburban rural type district. And when we had the switch over to digital, I knew it was we got a lot of phone calls from people about, because, TV viewing is something that's important to a lot of folks out there. And I can remember one day I was doing courthouse conferences, and I think I had 5 people in a row that came in and sat down and asked the exact same question about what was happening to their TV viewership. And so I know that these are really important questions to folks out there. And if I could, Ms. Gore, I'd like to start with you with this question. Do television viewers, and this could be maybe a loaded question, do television viewers understand how the current law works? And following up with that, what kind of complaints about satellite law does the FCC receive from viewers?
Mr. Latta, we looked into that, and I'm I'm happy to report that the number of complaints that we got over the past year, 2012, was about between 60 and 70 complaints that were cataloged as in this category. They have shifted over my experience with this subject area from a focus on concern about distance signals, and now the questions are more about local stations. The questions, I can't break them down into individual categories, but basically there are some situations where a consumer is getting the local package and then for some reason they're suddenly getting a different local package. And so they contact us to understand why that was changed. And there are different reasons why it's changed. Sometimes it is an error on the part of the satellite operator, and sometimes it's because that DMA map may have changed. And so it's something that is accurate. The essence of those complaints actually seems to be that consumers would like to choose the local stations that they're offered as opposed to being confined to those within the DMA. I'm not expressing an opinion. I'm reporting what their complaints are.
Let me just follow up with that just a little bit. When you do get those complaints, how long does it take for the turnaround time for those for the FCC to get back to the consumer with those answers?
Well, actually, typically, we have our wonderful call center folks who take a call, and they talk to the person on the phone, and they explain it to them. If they submit a complaint in writing, then someone gets back to them. And oftentimes, if it is a complaint that's specifically about a particular satellite carrier, they will, I believe they use the term, serve that complaint on the satellite carrier in order to get a response. So there's a process in place that has a certain time frame for the satellite carrier to respond in that case. Every once in a while, a consumer finds his or her way to me, and we get to have a lesson in copyright.
Well, following up with that, if I could, on the predictive model indicates that a viewer can get an adequate signal over the air, and there's an ineligible to receive distance signal service. The law allows the viewer to challenge that finding on a location test. Do viewers ever request such tests, and if so, what happens?
The tests would be requested from the satellite carrier, not from us. So I do not have data on that. I don't know how often it happens. It used to be an issue before. That used to be the topic of some complaints and inquiries. As I said, over the past year, we have not heard any of those. But I can't speak to that. The satellite carriers would know whether they're being requested to arrange for tests.
Well, I guess if I could then turn the dish then to maybe answer that question. Do you get those types of questions that come in from the consumers? Mr. Dodge?
Since today we provide local channels in all 210 markets, we don't provide traditional distant service, if you will, where that would really come into play. But my understanding is historically very few, back when we did provide those services.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the Vice Chairman for his work on this and other issues. Now recognize the fill-in ranking member from the great state of Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Many of us on this committee represent rural areas, both Republicans and Democrats. And many of the challenges that folks face in rural areas, both consumers and some of our broadcasters, seem to be different than some of the challenges that urban areas face for consumers and broadcasters. And I really would be interested in the view of you who have so much experience about how you would describe some of the particular challenges that tend to face folks and broadcasters in rural areas. Ms. Gore, could I start with you?
As I mentioned, the complaints that we get or the inquiries that we get are often about the local package, and sometimes, very often, that is a rural area where consumers want to be able to get perhaps more of the stations that are from their own state. I know that that's been an issue in Vermont historically, and in other places as well.
But not just Vermont, right? I mean, that's a rural area.
It's a rural area issue all across the country. That was what we were talking about, which we sometimes informally call the orphan county issue, where a county is in one state, but it's part of a DMA that's located predominantly in another state, and so there are not a lot of perhaps any in-state stations available to those consumers. It's a small problem, but it's a big problem, just in the way it's reported to me, for those areas where that occurs.
Thank you. I'd like to really get the benefit of each of you telling us your thoughts on the rural challenges.
Sure.
Mr. Dodge.
So I'd echo everything that Ms. Gore said. It's the short market problem. It's areas outside of our spot beams, as you would imagine, using Utah as the example, the corners of the state, very rural. And then also the Orphan County issue. It's a predominantly rural issue, and that occurs in 40 states today.
And do you have any suggestions on addressing that?
Yes, what we have historically proposed, which I think is pretty darn fair, but let's use Colorado as the example, where we have 2 counties in the southwestern portion of the state that are actually in the Albuquerque DMA. Our proposal has always been it will provide those folks Albuquerque locals, but let's also give them one in-state signal of their choice, preferably Denver, because our spot beam covers down there, and ultimately let them choose which they prefer.
Okay, Ms. Mago, thank you. Mr. Dodge.
From the broadcaster's perspective, one of the key challenges they face from the rural areas is making sure that they have enough revenues so that they can continue to provide the quality programming that they need to. But let me address the DMA issue for just a moment, if I could, please, because DMAs are not just sort of random boxes that are put around. They are designed by the Nielsen company to reflect where viewers are actually listening to the stations. And that's why they shift, as Ms. Gore was explaining. They shift when viewer patterns change. But for the most part, providing the local into local DMA market signal is going to address the needs of the county. There's a few places where that becomes a little bit more challenging. And one of the things that the carriers can do is to provide the in-state programming that's not duplicating that network primetime programming, and they can do that, and it's been done in several areas to address the issue of making sure that those that are in-state are able to receive their in-state information.
Thank you. Ms. Kiley?
Congressman, I would say from public television's perspective, serving rural areas is a top agenda item for us. We have a universal service mission, as I mentioned earlier, and we take that mission very seriously. I think part of our challenge with any paid television provider is that from a broadcast perspective, we serve over 98, close to 99% of this country with a free over-the-air signal. And it's been very costly to do that, and from a public television perspective, particularly in these rural areas. Rural areas such as Vermont, often your state you would know quite well, can be mountainous and the terrain can be difficult. And for public television to serve those areas, we do that with a series of expensive equipment, mini translators to fill in those coverage areas. And of course, in those areas, we also have limited populations from which we can derive, local support for our stations. And so we have a very robust broadcast presence in rural areas from a public television perspective, and we very much appreciate the local into local that's part of the satellite bill that helps us to mimic that presence in satellite legislation. I would say, touching a little bit, one other special fix that public television has that was in the Stella law, we have a unique situation where a handful of our states, about 21 of them, have statewide licensees, or the license are issued from the state to serve the residents of the entire state. Many of those are rural, not all of them, but many of them are rural. And so we were appreciative of the language in Stella that allows the satellite carriers, should they get the capacity to serve those statewide licensees with the signal originating out of their state public television networks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I yield back.
Just for the record, my district is 7 times the size of Vermont, plus. So, many translator, district of many translators. We'll go now to Representative Shimkus from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, great committee, great issues, a lot of fun. I've been on it a long time. I think every member should be issued a teenager in this digital age because then you are up to speed on the new technology and how they watch, how they view movies. I was talking to my son just before we came out, and he's watching, I've never seen it, The Walking Dead, and he can get first 2 years, I guess he watches on the internet, and then of course the 3rd year he can't. He's got to wait for the broadcast or whatever, and it just reiterates the difference of how people are viewing content and how they go about it, and so there's one benefit of a teenager. There's some disadvantages. I can talk about those later. So it's very exciting, and it's again, we want to support all the work you do, but we're going to talk locally too. And I was trying to, using my new technology and all this stuff, figure out my DMAs. I think I got 5: Springfield, Champaign, Decatur. That's the only one that's in Illinois. St. Louis, Cape Girardeau, Paducah, and Terre Haute. So I border 3 states. So we have this issue of the DMA and bleed over and the like. We just got to be careful, because in a congressional district that has any size, sometimes the folks will not want an Illinois signal. They'll want the St. Louis DMA, and they want to be there, where there may be others that will say, well, can't we get Illinois news because we're in a part of the state where they're receiving an Indiana station. So there's not a hard and fast rule of when you want to default to one or the other based upon the citizens of that area. So it's very tricky. So I'm just laying that out. We've experienced that. Let me ask a question on, does anyone know how many actually short markets there are?
There are 21.
And are there any in my, no, I mean, because since there are 21, what is a way that we can kind of fix that problem? And is this an avenue in a reauthorization to try to do that? And, yeah.
And to some extent, the market's fixing itself. As I noted earlier, with digital technology, stations are able to have multiple streams that they can put out over their signal, and they're in fact carrying.
Well, let me ask again, because I like the digital answer, so I don't know the answer now, but the digital cliff that we had initially, the analog signal went a long ways, and then we had the digital TV, and we had the digital cliff. Has technology pushed that digital signal back further out to meet the analog broadcast, or we still struggle with that?
The Commission did a lot of work in terms of trying to raise power levels to make sure that you were, in fact, duplicating those coverage areas that had been there before. And we're about to face it again as we look at the repacking that may happen as a result of the incentive auctions and reclamation of some of the broadcast.
The voluntary incentive auctions.
Voluntary incentive auctions that will be part of that. The repacking part has never been voluntary. Yeah. They hate it when I say that, but the repacking has never been voluntary, and that's going to cause some issues. But I think for your purposes today, the spot beams that are provided on the satellite can help to bring in some of that service as well.
Okay, let me finish up. I've got 1 minute left. And I agree with a lot of folks who are talked up here. Everyone used that there's some anachronism in the law, so that could be dealt with. So starting with Mr. Dodge, what would be an anachronism that you would like to get solved in a reauthorization or a rewrite in the law? Anything? This is trying to smoke you out to say, okay, what's your problem? What do you want fixed? Using a big word, I usually don't use them that much.
Sure. I'd say the anachronism writ large in all these laws is the fact that it's an unfair fight in retransmission consent negotiations today, and the people that suffer are the consumers, because there are more and more takedowns occurring. I think in 2010, there were roughly 10. 2011, there were 50. Okay. Last year, there were 100. And it's the consumer that's paying the price. So I think that needs to be fixed. Consumers need to keep getting the signal during while we work it out with the broadcasters, so to speak. And I'd also say the Orphan County issue is an anachronism of the whole system that needs to be worked out. And I think you raised a very good point. I mean, it may very well be that folks in southwestern Colorado prefer watching Albuquerque stations because they buy their Chevys in Albuquerque and they want to see those advertisements. But I think we should give them the opportunity to make that decision for themselves.
Okay, I'm going way over my time, and if I can get, Mr. Chairman, so why don't we just go down the line? Thanks.
First of all, you may have seen me kick Mr. Dodge under the table. We think that the retransmission consent negotiations are going forward. There have been a few.
This is what we want. I've been trained by Billy Tozan to get the fight going. So
remember, this was the educational session today. You missed the pre-meeting.
The Dish Network has been involved in a number of those disputes, but we all try to work them out together, and we'll continue to do that. I will note also, Mr. Shimkus, that I did determine that there are no short markets in your district.
Thank you.
So that's an issue that you don't need to worry about.
I would just echo my earlier comments and say we think this is a very complicated process, and we appreciate being included from the very beginning, and we will be looking for those anachronisms in the law along with you.
The only thing I would say, it goes back to what I said at the outset, which is I think that as a threshold, the subcommittee, the committee should look at whether or not the role of government, as it was originally constituted, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, what have you, is still applicable in the current state that we're in right now. I think that's the single biggest issue that needs to be addressed.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, we now turn to the former vice chair of the committee, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes, if you have questions.
Sure, why not? It's been asked several times before, but I haven't asked it. I am slightly confused on the local and the local, and here I'll just lay out the scenario. That in the Sandhills area, the middle of Nebraska, where very few reside, the only option is satellite. In an area that's right outside of, in Nebraska, a pretty good-sized town that has their own TV stations, in North Platte, Nebraska. But yet, the satellite for that area, even just barely outside of the signal range from those stations, they get Denver. And the networks that cover, if you're cable or you're in the signal, get the Husker games and the Husker news, and people around Plattsmouth that get their satellite get Denver Broncos news. They don't like that. They like the Broncos, but they want the Huskers. So what's the technology issue here? What's forbidding the satellite companies from being able to put in the local TV that's an hour and a half drive from these areas? Mr. Dodge, since you are a satellite guy, I'll let you try and answer that.
I am indeed. Well, with all due respect to what Ms. Mago said about the DMA system, I think it's largely a DMA system issue. We view it largely as a system that was set up in the 1950s based on what people were watching back then. And although theoretically DMAs shift over time based on actual viewership, there really is no way to change that viewership if you can only provide the local signal authorized for each DMA into that DMA. If, for example, we are allowed to do what I proposed for southwestern Colorado, which is give people the choice between Albuquerque and Denver, then over time it may switch to Denver. But to Congressman Shimkus' point, it may not, because those people might be actually interested in Albuquerque. And our view is let them decide, and then maybe the maps shift.
How about if the people in the area have actually received a letter from the FCC saying that they should be getting the North Platte TV stations? Is there a technical reason why the satellites couldn't do that area?
And that, I think what you're referring to is a case of significantly viewed, perhaps.
Yes.
And I'm not sure what the specific reason is in that particular area, but generally speaking, the problems we've had with significantly viewed are technology-wise. The signal that's significantly viewed may or may not be on the same spot beam as the local channel, which makes it very difficult to provide. And then there are also contractual issues sometimes where the station being invaded, so to speak, might condition their retransmission consent on us not importing a signal. But similarly, we have to get the consent of the station we want to import to actually do the importation, and they may not grant us that consent.
Okay. I don't know if that's the issue. I would think that would be odd that they don't want somebody 100 miles away from their station not to see their station. But the answer is the technology changes would be too costly, and I just didn't understand what that entailed, the technology changes.
Yeah, typically the issue is that the station that folks desire to import or that's significantly viewed is not on the same spot beam as the local market.
How much generally does that cost as a satellite company?
It depends. As satellites cost typically these days about $350 million apiece.
Well, okay, so you'd have to send up a whole new satellite to bring that?
In certain cases, yes.
Okay. Interesting. Well, my time's almost up, but I'm not done yet.
We would be happy to get the specifics of that particular issue for you.
You have them. Well, you may not personally, but your company does.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the 101 hearing we're having to start getting into this. Of course, the reason we're here is because Stella expires. The laws that we're discussing today have sunset provisions, and that's why we get to these various iterations, and it forces Congress to come back and look and work with industry and say what works, what doesn't work, and and hopefully when we're going into the next iteration before the expiration of Stella at the end of next year, we address the problems and the changes in the marketplace. It's a very dynamic marketplace. A lot of you have done some wonderful things to allow and bring high definition and great programming to more people, and so that sunset provision allows that to happen. Now, as we look at the broader marketplace of video regulations, most of them do not have sunsets, and I'd be curious to take. It's more a policy question, so Ms. Gore, I'll leave you. I'll hold you harmless on this one, but I would be curious to see with the rest of the panel what your thoughts are on not just looking at Section 119, but having sunset provisions on all of these laws that we would then force Congress to go back and say what is working, what isn't, not just in the satellite arena, but in the others. I'll start with you, Mr. Dodge.
Yeah, and I think since 119 is the actual statute that is expiring at the end of 2014, people tend to look at just that and say, I like this or I don't like that, it should sunset, it shouldn't. In our view of the world is, if you're going to consider letting that sunset, it's a much broader discussion. We do think there are problems with 119. I've mentioned a bunch of those today. But if you're going to let that sunset, then I think you have to look at the entire mosaic, if you will, or quilt of all the statutory copyright licenses, 122, the cable licenses, because in my view, and as long as I've been involved in this, they're all interrelated. And you can't just throw out 119 and not look at things like must carry, retrans, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's a discussion that's worthy of having.
Maybe another day we'll have that discussion. Ms. Mago.
Well, if you're letting me go outside of the realm of the specific hearing that we have here, I mentioned the broadcast ownership regulations are ones that we have advocated for some time, need to have some relook at them.
I agree with you there.
Different.
Thank you, Ms. Keeley.
Thank you. I would echo it. It is very complicated and very intertwined. Many of these pieces are very intertwined, and we do just hope, we public television are must-carry stations, and doing things like doing away with the compulsory license could actually, even though we aren't involved in retransmission consent, could impact public television stations. And so we're just appreciative that the committee is taking an early look at this, and hope that they'll continue to look at how intertwined these issues are and what the unique needs of local public television stations are.
Congressman, I would agree with what you said. I think that it's never a bad idea to have Congress go back and see what's working and what's not working. I think implicit in your question is the simple fact that these things are intertwined, and that if you look at them collectively, you're more likely to have a better view of what works for the consumer in the long run. And so I would agree with what you're saying.
And I think you had talked in your testimony about what is it that consumers really want. Consumers, they want content, they want the entertainment.
Right.
They don't necessarily want to buy a satellite dish. They want to have the content and the entertainment that comes with it. They don't want a cable or fiber optic is not why they're paying a monthly bill. It's because of what comes in. And so when you look at what they're really interested in, is it the broadcast signal that they're interested in, or is it the content that comes with that broadcast signal?
Well, I think, quite honestly, it's a little bit of both. I think that there's, people want local broadcasters for news and things like that. I think they want content. I think the short answer, Congressman, is consumers want everything right now. And the good news is that they're living in an era where you've got a better chance of getting everything than you did before. You look at the television as it existed when we were children, and you look at the television that our children are growing up with, those are vastly different platforms, frankly. And in the future, it's going to be even more. I think the real question, and the question which is underlying the entire discussion today, is what is the proper role of the government in terms of facilitating that happening? And my focus, frankly, is on the compulsory licenses because we think they unnecessarily dampen the development of that market. But to your question, it bears looking at all of the different issues that are before us.
Okay. And last question before I run out of time, Ms. Mago. When you look at what's happened with, with, of course, Dish is here, DirecTV, similar, the ability to negotiate with cable companies for their copyright content, we've seen a real dramatic expansion of cable companies. You got the Food Network, Nickelodeon, a lot of these other pay TV companies that's seen real expansion in their viewership because of their ability to negotiate in a more open marketplace. Would you say that the same kind of marketplace should exist with with retransmission consent, with compulsory?
For local stations, the signal that they put together is the amalgamation of all of the programming, and there's many different kinds of authorizations, licenses that one needs to get from in that area. Our members continue to be concerned that trying to put that together on a local station basis is one that's a difficult process.
Thanks. I think we can continue that conversation, look forward to it, but I appreciate all of your input today for being here. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing today. I just wish my colleague from Nebraska was still here so that we could give him a hard time for wanting to watch Nebraska football.
He may be watching on a distant signal somewhere in an orphan area.
I don't have much room to talk, though, according to some of the performance we've seen the past couple of years out of some Colorado teams. So I'll just stop with that. But I wanted to particularly welcome Mr. Dodge to the committee today as a result of redistricting. Dish is a constituent company now. I'm glad that you could be here today, and all the witnesses, thank you for your time. I wanted to just talk briefly about some of the issues that most of you have touched on already at various times throughout the testimony, and so to Mr. Dodge, can you just give me a quick explanation, the committee a quick explanation, what would happen if Stella were to expire, and what would that effect be on consumers across the country?
Yeah, it's with respect to Dish particularly, it would mean that the short markets I described, those folks would no longer be on a level playing field with folks in other markets around the country because they'd lose whatever affiliates are not represented in their particular DMAs. They would lose the ability to access that programming. Similarly, folks who are outside of our spot beams would lose their local channels. RVs and commercial trucks would no longer be able to get network programming via satellite. And with respect to DirecTV, who doesn't provide local service in all markets, they'd lose the ability to provide network programming to folks who are unserved by their local broadcast stations. And presumably, they would lose subscribers who've been grandfathered from prior Satellite Home Viewer Act reauthorizations.
Ms. Gore, would you add anything to that or want to add anything to that, if you can?
No, I think that covered the list that I'm aware of.
Ms. Mago?
Only to note that I think, again, as I said in my testimony, that's a diminishing number as we go through the various fixes that are happening, including addressing the issues in short markets through the stations, digital channels, and such things.
Okay. And then wanted to take another opportunity, Mr. Dodge, to perhaps have you respond to something that was in the Ms. Mago's testimony. And I believe it was stated on page 7 that today over 98% of all U.S. television viewers have the option of viewing their local network affiliates by satellite. And then goes on to say, with few exceptions, there are no unserved viewers in areas in which local and local satellite transmissions are available, and that accordingly, no public policy justifies treating satellite subscribers in local and local markets as unserved and therefore eligible to receive distant network signals. talks a little bit about viewing that language as perhaps a loophole, but was wondering if you could respond to that assertion and whether or not you view that as a loophole, what would happen to your customers if that were to change?
Yes, we don't view that as a loophole. We view that as exactly what the law says, which is if there's a retransmission dispute, then we're no longer offering a local affiliate related to that network, and we're allowed to import a distant signal to folks who are unserved in the traditional sense, meaning they don't get an off-air signal with decent quality.
Okay, and then to both you and Ms. Mago as well, conditions in the law sometimes prevent viewers from gaining access to the programming they really want. We've talked about that here. Broadcasters can waive some of these conditions on a case-by-case basis, and do they ever, and if not, why not? And I guess Ms. Mago, I'll start with you.
I think Mr. Dodge said a little while ago that that doesn't really happen on the Dish Network, as I understood it. If I misunderstood your question, I'm sorry. But in terms of the broadcasters, what broadcasters are looking for is to make sure that they're able to serve their audiences and continue to be able to do that by having local viewers. We are able to do that, maximize the amount of the revenues that we can then plow back into the better service, and that's why we look at those markets and make sure that the local and local service is there. It helps the viewers themselves because they're able to get whatever local weather information and other things are important to them, and that's why we continue.
Do broadcasters ever end up in the waiver?
There are a few that I know of that have done that. I think it's becoming less now because one of the concerns that was available for a while was that the high definition programming wasn't available through the satellite, and that we're now getting to the point where that is always going to be available for the local stations as well. I'm aware of a market I have placed in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the local station there, in fact, had granted a waiver to allow the distant signal to come in because it was high definition when the local signal was not, and I'm hoping that that's been corrected.
And the good news for Mr. Terry is that in a couple of years, the Cornhuskers and the Buffaloes will be playing again, so he'll be able to at least watch that game, even if it comes from Colorado. But
that sounds like many hooves coming along.
That's right. That's right. To that point, in some of the discussion that we've had, we've talked about the markets, and I guess for the entire panel, as I run out of time here, do we know how many viewers are assigned to a designated market area that is not within their state? So I know we've identified the number of areas, but do we actually know or have an idea of how many viewers are there?
I'm sorry, I don't.
I do know in Colorado, I believe it's 10,000 folks who are TV households.
In the southwestern part?
Yes, in those two counties, but nationwide, I don't have the number off the top of my head.
Okay.
From a public television perspective, I know we had about 21 of our statewide licensees that were impacted by that. With some states it being a much bigger problem. For instance, in Wyoming, I believe that I think it was close to about 75% of viewers in that state resided outside of from a public television perspective, the DMA, where our public television station had all three of its transmitters located. So it varies from state to state, but for public television, some of those areas out west and in smaller parts of the east were problematic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leniency with the time.
No problem. We're going to move now to the gentlelady from North Carolina, a new member of our subcommittee. We're delighted to have Renee Elmers with us, and we look forward to your questions as we wrap up this this hearing.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to be here. Apologize for being late. I had dueling subcommittees going on, so thank you to our panel for being here as well. Ms. Gore, I have a question for you. Are there instances where the local broadcasters, as defined by the statute, is not actually carrying news, alerts, closings, sports, civic affairs, and other content in the viewer state?
Yes, I believe there are those situations that this plays into what we've been talking about as the orphan county situation, so that technically on paper it may appear that there's an in-state station in the DMA, but it may be a station that's programming does not include news or weather or traffic or public affairs of that sort. I'm sure they're meeting their public interest requirements that Ms. Mago would know about.
Yes, they are.
She would assure you but they don't necessarily have the kind of newsroom staff or situation to cover breaking weather events or something of that sort.
Thank you. And I have a question, and I would like for each one of the panel to give a quick, brief response. Because this is kind of our introductory hearing on this issue, we're not yet debating on how to change the law, so to speak, but we do need to know what the main problems are. So if every panelist could just, without giving us a solution, so to speak, just kind of touch on the problems that we need to be aware of, what your main issue is with the law and how we can be looking towards the future. And I'll start with Ms. Gore.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm not here to talk about any problems we have with the law. I will only say that there seem to be some circumstances where perhaps the hope was that the availability of significantly viewed stations might help to alleviate some of the concerns that some consumers have had, and I'm not sure if the significantly viewed option is being taken advantage of as often as it might be. My colleagues would know more about that and also would know more about why that might be.
Okay. Mr. Dodge?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing we would like to see remedied is having the retransmission consent process be put on a more level playing field between the broadcasters and the distributors, and fixed in such a manner that consumers don't inevitably lose access to network programming during disputes.
Perfect. And I, of course, disagree with what Mr. Dodge just said. But I would also say that our biggest issue is that we want to encourage local service.
Okay. And I would say we are taking an early look at the law and its implementation and looking for any problem areas that are there. But I will reiterate that we were quite pleased with the process. We trust the process. It worked quite well last time. And we were very appreciative that our unique needs were addressed the last go-round with Stella. And we hope that if we come upon any of those issues again, that we can, again, work with this leadership of this committee in Congress.
Excellent.
And from our perspective, it's very simply that the committee step back and take a look at the law and determine, that we believe there are pieces of it that that are trying to solve a problem which no longer exists. And so we would ask them to look, to look at those, and then at a minimum to not expand those areas where we believe that the government intervention has, reduced our ability to be compensated fairly for the work that we create.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your responses. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to wrap up this hearing. And I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from North Carolina for her participation. And I think we should have an online contest to name this one Eloise. But I've been struggling trying to figure out how we do that. So we'll welcome your suggestions.
Please just
I actually worked on that the last time, so I'll get that back to you.
You'd get that to me. I know it's not weighing in on any policy, but the name is important. And given 4 reauthorizations you've lived through. We want to thank our panelists for testifying today. We appreciate your input as we begin down this path. We will have, obviously, additional hearings going forward, and I'm sure all of us will have lots of individual meetings going forward to have these discussions. And so thank you all for your participation. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.
Eloise, this has been one of the pleasures of my life to testify with you. So are you.
Yeah, no.